on your website that you referred to Asian Americans as a minority model. I had never heard of that reference before.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell me a little bit more about that? Why they're the minority model?
Well, it comes from several things. It comes from several things because of just stereotypes, but also it's been ingrained and it's part of the Asian American culture to be successful and to work hard. But because of that aspect of their culture, then there comes a stereotype that if you're Asian American, you're born with some different physiological or biological makeup. And so, does that make sense so far?
That
what
helps
I'm saying?
make you be able to perform, someone who's Asian American to be able to perform more than someone who's not Asian American.
Yes. And so, but going back to what I said earlier, if someone...
So nature more than nurture.
Yes. So, again, I know that you're a teacher, and one of your biggest things is getting parents involved. And you have great parents that are willing to be involved, but other ones aren't. But the parents that are more involved, your students are more successful. And so that's kind of what the culture is in the Asian American society, is that parents are involved. You have a set of high standards. Okay, you are going to work hard. At school, you're going to listen to your teachers and focus. Then at home, if there's any homework or studies that needs to be done, you need to do that as well. And so...
Well, I found it interesting. I've had many Asian American students over the years, and of course I teach the younger grades, but I found it interesting that the Asian American families, more than any other ethnicity, and I've taught children from ethnicities and backgrounds from all around the world, I find that they, which is scary, they follow the teacher blindly. Whatever I say or the district or the school says, they will do what we say. And sometimes they won't even question a program or question the effectiveness. They will just, they have respect and they will follow instead of question. And to me, I think that's a little scary.
Yeah, that's where it comes.
They assume that everyone is going to help their child, or I think it's from the culture of respect, and also, in other words, so oftentimes they do not advocate for themselves. They assume that the teacher or somebody else is advocating for them as well at school, and so I have to constantly say, please, advocate for your child, or your child may need help with this.
Yeah, that's another aspect of the model minority theory, because there's the idea that if you're an Asian American, you are going to see someone as your elder, you will respect them, you will not question them.
That makes sense.
And so if you have a student this year that is of that ethnicity, his parents might just say, you're the teacher, you know what's best, like, you're the superior.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. They see me as a superior, and thank goodness I help them and I support their child. And this is only an example of one student this year. Yes, otherwise, like I said, it could be the adverse result if they continue to follow blindly the teachers as seeing them as absolute authority figures.
Yeah, and I think they're just so used as a culture, not to overgeneralize, but just what different studies have seen is they're so used to that they've had a stalemate placed over them, and they're just like, well, we're going to follow that because that's what society expects of us. It says, you're the model minority, you're going to obey, you're going to be successful, and then you just have to do that. You can't steer away from that.
Okay, so another question Um, I've actually known of several people and worked with some elderly people, individuals that were in the internment camps. And I didn't even really learn a lot about the internment camps until I was in high school and older. It's just something that wasn't talked about as I grew up, in history or otherwise. Um, but I've often thought about this in myself, do you think that it was proper or correct, I'm not sure if that would be the right word, to have them be gathered into camps? I'm not, and the conditions, I'm not saying the conditions were good in the camps, oftentimes they were not. So I'm not talking about that aspect, but should they have been watched or monitored, like after 9/11, or not, do you think, just based on their culture,
I think it was,
ethnicity?
me personally, it was done out of fear, because I remember reading something that a fiction, no author, or not a fictional author, an author wrote in a novel. He said there's this character that researches global warming, and he says, with a participant that he talks to, he says, well, what we love to do as a nation is we love fear. When, I think he even gave the example of the internment camps, we had Japanese that attacked what was not American soil yet, but we had claim over it. And so we said, oh, we're going to get freaked out and we're going to just react instead of act. And that was the result. So I definitely don't think it's necessary. I think watching someone is only necessary when a legitimate crime has been committed, because we see a pattern all throughout history that repeats itself, where people were wrongfully punished, starting with the slaves. Back when the colonists came, they said, okay, here are these foreigners, we don't like them, they look different, or their culture is different, they eat smelly food, so we're going to make them our slaves, and they're going to work on our plantations because they're right here and we're right here. And then we keep going.
Based on factors that are not relevant.
Yeah.
Looking through your website, I learned actually quite a bit. Like I said, I've been involved, had the privilege of teaching kids from all around the world in my classes in the United States, but I learned a lot about my kids, Asian American kids. But there's one question I have: how many Asian Americans are there in the United States now?
Well, different censuses and different documents can make it kind of complicated sometimes to find an accurate estimation of how many there are, because they couple them with Pacific Islanders. So like, what I mean when I say that is, like, we have our Caucasians grouped in one, then you have your African Americans or your black grouped in one, like when you're filling out the sentence.
So possibly the someone who's Filipino, they would be considered Asian Americans, but they would consider them Pacific Islanders as well.
Yes, and so with Pacific Islanders and like Asian Americans, but more generally Asian Americans, the definition of someone who is part of the ethnicity falls under the category of China, North and South Korea, Japan, places like Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam and India. But then the other ones are separate, because sometimes people think, well, if you're from Asia, you're an Asian American, but that continent is so massive and so vast that it's almost like divided into like different like regions or subcategories that define like who an Asian American is or what other groups they belong to. So on the 2010 status, and as well as different websites such as the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Urban housing development website, the federally ran one, it said there is less than 10% of the population in the United States that is Asian American or Pacific Islander, since those two are grouped together. And so it's interesting to think that they're so low because people associate them again with the model minority of wanting success and prosperity because they're smarter than everyone else. But when in reality, there's a higher population of Hispanic or Latin Americans or African Americans that live in this country, so.
Anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about this. I think back to my first year of teaching. I had a young girl in my classroom. She's Chinese American, and I had stereotyped Chinese Americans. I had thought and assumed that they were all very clean, very very proper. And this little girl in my class, I had noticed that she wore the same outfit for almost a week at a time. And so I began to worry and be concerned that maybe she was being neglected or wasn't having her needs met, because I continued to see the same outfit again and again, though she looked, clean, and her hair was combed and what have you. And then after talking, I was talking to an acquaintance of mine who was from China, asking her, what did she think I should do? And come to find out, it is very common to wear the same outfit, especially with children, a type of play clothing at school for 3 to 5 days, and then you wash your clothing. And so I would have made the mistake of wondering if, maybe possibly reporting a little neglect. However, after talking with this other adult, I realized that no, this is the culture. There's still that huge stereotype of working in the family Chinese Asian restaurant, and that is the case.
What you see on A
sometimes.
Christmas Story.
Yes. Yes. So it's sad to see that there are so many stereotypes still of many nationalities. But I think the key is with children. If you teach children to love one another, care for one another, not, they see the difference. Of course, they're going to see a difference physically or otherwise, or culturally. But if they see what is the same or similar instead of what is different, there is great hope in our society. But I do think it needs to start with the children, and as they grow and they have their own children, then after generation, I think there can be a lot of change and a lot of growth. And I have seen that in my own life. A lot of great, wonderful changes overall, as far as stereotyping, prejudice, some huge, big changes. For example, what used to be considered commonly accepted with my parents, a comment here, a comment there. Nowadays, I wouldn't have considered my parents prejudiced whatsoever, or at all. And now, occasionally, they're aging. They will make a comment here and there and when I was young, I would have never considered them prejudiced, like I said, but that is a comment that is not acceptable
Very
to me now, very offensive to me or to others, and they don't realize, because that's what they grew up with.